It is 11:11. The police-involved shooting deaths of two black men, one in Louisiana, the other in Minnesota this week, along with the deadly attack on police officers in Dallas, has put the topics of race and policing in the national spotlight. Before the events of last week, a lot of opinion polls have been taken on those very issues, and here to offer some perspective based off the polls is John Johnson, president of Edgeworth Economics and the author of the book Everydata. The first polls you looked at deal with the perception of race relations in America. What did they tell you?
The polling questions were actually asked about the proportion of Americans that think race relations were generally good. And at the time that President Obama was elected, they were sort of at historic highs, 60 to 65% of Americans, pretty much regardless of race, believing that race relations were fairly good. 8 years later, those numbers have pretty much flipped. 61% of African Americans believe race relations are bad, and 45% of white Americans believe race relations are bad. So we've seen a noticeable change in the last 8 years in response to those polling questions.
Now let's talk a bit about the numbers when it comes to how people perceive the treatment of African Americans by the police. What'd you learn?
Well, one of the other interesting questions in the polls were actually a question that literally asked both African Americans and white Americans, did you think African Americans were treated less fairly relative to whites in dealing with the police? And the numbers are pretty striking. White Americans generally respond about 50% thought African Americans were treated less fairly, but black Americans, 84% thought African Americans were treated less fairly in dealing with the police. Now, these numbers were before the instance of this past week as well. So that's coming into this week. That's what those numbers showed.
And we can expect even more opinion polls on this. And there's a lot to consider with those because the topics are so emotionally charged.
It is actually really important because unlike a survey that asks you sort of a more objective question, do you own a car? The answer is yes or no. But when you have these emotional issues or these opinion questions, first of all, they're very shaped by the question. How is it that the pollsters actually ask the question? If there's sort of certain inflammatory words in the questions or emotional words, that's one thing you have to watch for. The second thing is that, of course, when there are these recent events, they tend to be front and center. And as horrific as they are, they can definitely swing opinions. We talked about this a few weeks ago with the gun polling, that after instances where there are mass shootings, we generally see sort of spikes in opinions about gun control, and then they kind of dissipate. Should look for the same kind of effects here to see whether or not there really is a spike around these events. The one other thing you always have to remember is these types of things are very much shaped by personal experiences, which includes how people interpret the question. Even the notion of what do you think race relations means in a generic polling question could be something very different for different people.
And finally, you looked at some of the statistics involving shootings by police officers and officer fatalities. What has that shown us?
If you try to look at the numbers, and again, there's a lot of different data sources, but the best you can tell, there has been an increase in both shootings by police and in officer fatalities in the first half of 2016. But if you look at the long run overall, you should remember that homicides and violent crimes have dropped precipitously since the mid-1990s. There aren't as good numbers in terms of shootings by police of African Americans, but one thing that is notable is that there is a significant difference with respect to victims of gun violence in the U.S. Young African Americans die from gun violence about 90 out of every 100,000 times, whereas young white men, 20 out of 100,000. So that's a pretty stark difference with respect to what the numbers show about who the victims of gun violence are in the U.S.
John Johnson, president of Edgeworth Economics and author of the book Everydata, joining us on Skype.